blood is thicker than water, but it turns out watertight federal compliance is much harder to fake. When my father-in-law handed my life's work to his golden boy son, he thought he was securing a legacy. Instead, he just pulled the pin on a multi-million-dollar corporate grenade. The mahogany boardroom smelled of expensive scotch, arrogance, and old money. Rain streaked the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Pennsylvania Avenue, blurring the Washington Monument into a gray smudge. At the head of the table sat Arthur Sterling, my father-in-law, his silver hair perfectly coiffed, radiating the kind of absolute certainty only multi-generational wealth can buy. Next to him was Julian, his 32-year-old son, wearing a tailored suit that couldn't hide his nervous, boyish posture. I sat opposite them, a thick manila folder resting beneath my palms. For 15 years, I had built Sterling Defense Logistics from a regional courier service into a Tier 1 federal contractor. I knew every compliance officer in the Pentagon by their first name. I had memorized the Federal Acquisition Regulations, FAR, like scripture. But to Arthur, I wasn't the architect of his empire, I was just the guy who married his daughter. The family should stay in control of the company, Donald, Arthur said, his voice smooth, carrying the heavy weight of an ultimatum. He didn't look me in the eye. Instead, he adjusted his gold cufflinks. Julian has an MBA from Wharton. It's time he takes the reins as Senior VP of Federal Relations. You at 51, well, you've hit your ceiling here. We need fresh, family blood at the top. Julian smirked, trying to look imposing but failing miserably. He looked like a kid who had just been handed the keys to a Ferrari without knowing how to drive a stick shift. I looked at the mahogany table, noticing a tiny scratch near the edge. For a split second, a wave of hot anger flared in my chest. 15 years of 80-hour workweeks, missed family dinners, and red-eye flights to D.C., all brushed away because of a last name. But then, a profound, icy calm washed over me. I looked at Arthur, then at Julian. They truly had no idea how this business actually ran. They thought federal contracts were won over golf games and expensive dinners. I understand, Arthur, I said, my voice remarkably steady. I stood up, smoothing the front of my jacket. I closed my manila folder, the one containing the unfiled, highly sensitive GSA compliance certifications that required my personal digital signature to remain active. I wish you both the absolute best of luck. Julian chuckled. Don't take it personally, Don. It's just business. Family business. I smiled, a genuine, polite smile that didn't reach my eyes. Of course, Julian. Just business. I calmly gathered my personal files, slid my laptop into my briefcase, and walked out of the boardroom. The glass doors clicked shut behind me with a definitive, satisfying snap. As I rode the elevator down to the lobby, the weight of the Sterling Empire lifted off my shoulders, replaced by a sudden, electric surge of adrenaline. They wanted a family business. I was going to give them exactly what was left of it. By the time I reached my car in the underground parking lot, my phone was already buzzing. It was a text from Marcus Vance, the Chief Procurement Officer for the Department of Defense's Logistics Wing, and a close friend of 12 years. He wanted to confirm our usual morning briefing regarding the upcoming $420 million supply chain renewal contract, a contract that accounted for 60% of Sterling Logistics' annual revenue. I started the engine, staring at the glowing dashboard. If Arthur and Julian wanted to play corporate chess, they should have checked who actually owned the board. What they didn't realize was that the federal compliance files weren't just paperwork, they were the literal lifeblood of the company, and the government only trusted the hand that signed them. The air in my new office smelled of fresh paint and industrial carpet cleaner. It was a modest suite on K Street, a fraction of the size of the Sterling headquarters, but the view of the Capitol was clear, unobstructed, and sharp. On the glass door, the temporary vinyl lettering read, Vanguard Compliance and Logistics. It was day 3 of my independence, and the silence in the room was beautiful. I sat behind my desk, sipping black coffee from a paper cup, watching the twin monitors in front of me. On the left screen was my personal secure database, containing the proprietary compliance frameworks I had developed over 15 years. On the right screen was the Federal Awardee Performance and Integrity Information System, FAPIIS. The clock was ticking. In the world of federal contracting, a lapse in compliance is treated like a structural crack in a submarine. The moment the pressure shifts, the hull collapses. Because Julian had been too busy redecorating his new corner office to read the transition memos I left on his desk, he hadn't noticed the expiring GSA schedule certifications. My phone rang. The caller ID showed Marcus Vance's direct line from the Pentagon. Donald. Marcus's deep voice boomed through the speaker, devoid of its usual warmth. What the hell is going on over at Sterling? We just ran our automated pre-award audit for the upcoming logistics cycle. Their system flagged a critical data security noncompliance. The digital signature on the technical validation file is missing. I am no longer with Sterling Logistics, Marcus, I replied calmly, spinning my pen. Julian Sterling is the new Senior VP of Federal Relations. I believe he is handling the Washington accounts now. A heavy, telling silence stretched over the line. I could almost hear the gears turning in Marcus's mind. In D.C., personnel changes in critical defense infrastructure are looked at through a microscope. Julian. Marcus finally spoke, his tone dripping with skepticism. The kid who crashed his father's yacht in Annapolis 3 years ago. Donald, the renewal deadline for the Tier 1 supply chain contract is in exactly 14 days. If those compliance gaps aren't closed by a certified officer, we legally cannot renew. The system automatically pulls the solicitation. I am aware, I said, looking out at the rainy Washington streets. But as of Monday, Vanguard Logistics is fully certified, fully bonded, and open for business. My personal FAR credentials and security clearances are active and attached to my new firm. Another pause. This one was shorter, sharper. Send me your capability statement, Donald. Officially. By noon. By Friday of that week, the first domino fell. The Department of Defense quietly issued a temporary administrative hold on Sterling's active contract renewals due to failure to provide certified compliance continuity. To the outside world, it looked like a minor bureaucratic delay. To anyone who knew how Washington worked, it was a flashing red beacon of absolute panic. I spent the weekend working out of my new office, eating lukewarm takeout pizza under the glow of fluorescent lights, drafting proposals that targeted every single one of Sterling's vulnerable federal accounts. I wasn't stealing their business, I was simply offering a lifeboat to clients who realized their current captain didn't know how to navigate the storm. On Tuesday morning, exactly 10 days after I walked out, the first official request for proposal, RFP, landed directly in my new corporate inbox. It was an expedited federal invitation to bid on the very contract that kept the lights on at Sterling Logistics. Julian had no idea the water was rising around his ankles, and by the time he felt the chill, the current would already be dragging him under. Stay with us. To witness the exact moment Julian has to explain to the board why a $420 million federal contract vanished into thin air, and see how Arthur's family legacy crumbles in less than 3 minutes. The morning of the emergency board meeting arrived with a brutal, cloudless clarity. I stood in the kitchen of my apartment, buttoning my vest, watching the early sunlight catch the edge of the Potomac River. For 15 years, my life had been dictated by the rhythms of the Sterling corporate calendar. Today, for the first time, I was entirely outside of it, yet I was the only person in Washington who knew exactly what was about to happen in that room. At 9 a.m., the glass and steel tower of Sterling Logistics was likely a hive of controlled terror. I could picture it perfectly, the assistants moving with frantic, hurried steps, the low, anxious murmurs by the espresso machines, the smell of panic disguised as freshly brewed coffee. Thanks to an old colleague who still kept tabs on the internal server, I received a text message containing the meeting agenda. Item number 1. Federal Contract Renewal Status Update. The Sterling boardroom was filled to capacity. All 12 board members, men and women who controlled billions in institutional capital, were seated around the massive mahogany table. Arthur sat at the head, his expression a mask of stern, aristocratic confidence, though a subtle twitch in his left jaw betrayed his nerves. Next to him, Julian looked visibly pale. His hands were tucked beneath the table to hide the fact that they were shaking. "Let's begin," Arthur said, tapping his gold fountain pen against his legal pad. Julian walked the board through the final signing of the DoD supply chain renewal. "We want to finalize the revenue projections for Q3. Julian cleared his throat, a dry, raspy sound that echoed poorly in the high-ceilinged room. He reached for his tablet, his fingers fumbling with the screen lock. "Yes, well," Julian began, his voice lacking its usual Wharton-bred swagger. We've encountered a minor, purely administrative glitch in the federal procurement portal. The system is temporarily showing a pending review status for our primary certifications. It's a routine bureaucratic delay, nothing to worry about. A senior board member, a retired 3-star general named Henderson who had known me for a decade, leaned forward. His eyes narrowed, sharp as flint. A glitch, Julian? Henderson asked, his voice cutting through the room like a cold wind. I spoke with my contacts at the Pentagon an hour ago. They aren't calling it a glitch.
They're calling it a material breach of compliance continuity. The automated system didn't delay our contract. It disqualified our submission, because there was no certified compliance officer attached to the entity. Arthur frowned, his protective fatherly instincts instantly kicking in. General, I assure you, Julian has the situation fully under control. It's a matter of resubmitting the digital credentials. With whose signature, Arthur? Henderson shot back, slamming a printed document onto the center of the table. The FAR regulations state that the validation officer must have a minimum of 5 years of consecutive, verified federal oversight experience with this specific asset class. Julian has been here for 17 days. Donald was the only person in this building who held that specific clearance. The room went completely still. The silence that followed was heavy, suffocating, and absolute. Julian looked at his father, his eyes wide with a sudden, childlike desperation.
We can just hire a consultant to sign it, Julian whispered, his confidence completely evaporating. We can pay whatever it takes. You can't buy a federal security clearance on 48 hours' notice, you idiot, Henderson snapped, abandoning all corporate politeness. The deadline passed at midnight. The solicitation closed. Arthur's face drained of color. The silver-haired patriarch, who had spent his entire life believing that family status was a shield against the realities of the market, looked down at his legal pad. The scratch on the mahogany table, the one I had stared at just over 2 weeks ago, seemed to mock him. If we didn't get the contract, Arthur asked, his voice suddenly sounding old, thin, and brittle, then who did? Julian couldn't answer. He looked down at his tablet, where the official federal award notice was glaring back at him in stark digital black and white. The name of the winning bidder wasn't Sterling Logistics.
The corporate empire hadn't just lost its crown jewel. It had handed the keys directly to the man they had escorted out the door. The silence in the boardroom was no longer polite. It was the heavy, suffocating quiet of a sinking ship before the water reaches the engines. General Henderson was the first to pull up the live federal procurement dashboard on his own laptop. The blue light from the screen reflected off his glasses, mirroring the cold calculations happening in his mind. Vanguard Compliance and Logistics, Henderson read aloud, his voice dropping an octave. He looked up, his gaze fixing directly on Arthur. A brand new entity, registered exactly 12 days ago. Their technical score was a perfect 100. Our score wasn't even calculated because we were disqualified on page 1. Arthur's hand tightened around his gold fountain pen until his knuckles turned as white as his hair. Vanguard? Who owns Vanguard? Julian didn't look up from his tablet. His fingers were frozen on the glass screen. He didn't need to check the public registration records. He already knew the name attached to the corporate charter. It's Donald. Julian whispered, his voice cracking slightly. The warden confidence had completely vanished, leaving behind a terrified 32-year-old who realized the safety net of his father's name had just torn wide open. He took the credentials with him. He was the sole registered custodian of our past performance metrics. He didn't take them, Julian, Henderson barked, standing up and buttoning his jacket. You threw them out the door when you let him leave. You thought this business was about moving trucks and shipping containers. It's about trust. The government doesn't trust the Sterling name. They trusted Donald's signature. The room erupted into a controlled chaos of panicked phone calls and frantic whispering.
2 institutional board members representing a major pension fund immediately began packing their leather briefcases. In the world of high-stakes corporate logistics, a 60% drop in projected quarterly revenue doesn't just mean a bad year. It means an immediate, catastrophic devaluation of the company's stock. Arthur sat frozen at the head of the table, staring at the empty chair opposite him where I used to sit. The thin layer of aristocratic certainty that had protected him for decades was completely gone, shattered by a bureaucracy that didn't care about family bloodlines or country club connections. "Call him," Arthur ordered, his voice trembling slightly as he looked at Julian. "Call Donald right now. Offer him whatever he wants. Senior VP, Chief Operating Officer, a seat on the board. Tell him we will double his old salary." Julian reached for his phone, his hands shaking so violently he almost dropped it onto the mahogany table.
He dialed my number, placing the call on speaker so his father could hear. The phone rang once, twice, 3 times. Across town, in my quiet, sunlit K Street office, I watched the phone buzz against the clean wood of my desk. I let it ring until it went to voicemail. I had no intention of answering. When you pull the pin on a grenade to save a family legacy, you don't get to ask the guy who built the bunker to come back and catch it for you. By the time the sun began to set behind the Capitol dome, the local financial news networks were already running the ticker, Sterling Logistics under review after major federal contract loss. The first brick had fallen, and the rest of the wall was already beginning to lean. The next morning, the financial storm hit with the force of a Category 5 hurricane. By 9:30 a.m., Sterling Logistics stock price was in freefall, dropping 22% in the opening minutes of trading. The institutional investors weren't just walking away. They were running for the exits, dragging the company's valuation down into the mud. I watched the drama unfold from a completely different vantage point. My K Street office was quiet, save for the hum of the printer spitting out finalized, federally sealed employment contracts. By noon, 4 of my former top compliance analysts, the real backbone of the Sterling operation, had quietly resigned from the family firm and walked through my front door. They didn't want to stay on a sinking ship commanded by a panicked heir. At 2 p.m., a sleek black town car pulled up outside my building. Arthur Sterling didn't send an assistant this time. He didn't send Julian. He came alone. When he pushed open the glass door to Vanguard Logistics, the change in him was striking. The posture of the proud, untouchable patriarch was gone. He looked smaller, his expensive overcoat hanging loosely from his shoulders, his face lined with the sudden gray exhaustion of a man who had stayed up all night watching his empire evaporate. "Donald," Arthur said, stopping in the middle of the small lobby. He didn't look at the modest furniture or the temporary paper signage, his eyes fixed directly on mine. "We need to talk." "Hello, Arthur," I said, standing up from my desk but not coming forward to shake his hand. "You're a long way from Pennsylvania Avenue." He swallowed hard, looking down at his polished leather shoes for a brief second before forcing his gaze back up. "Let's skip the pleasantries. The board is prepared to offer you the CEO position. Complete creative control, a golden parachute, and a compensation package that will make you one of the highest-paid executives in the sector. Julian will be moved to a non-operational role in philanthropy. The family stays in control of the equity, but you run the show." I listened to him, letting his words hang in the crisp, quiet air of the office. A month ago, this offer would have been my ultimate victory. But looking at him now, I realized how fundamentally he still misunderstood the situation. "You still think this is about a title, Arthur," I said softly, leaning against the edge of my desk. "You think you can just write a bigger check and undo the damage. But the DoD supply chain contract isn't pending anymore. It's gone. It's sitting on my server, fully executed and locked in for the next 7 years. We can file an injunction, we can appeal the compliance audit," Arthur began, his voice rising with a touch of his old desperate authority. "With what standing?" I interrupted gently, with a thin, ironic smile. "Your company failed a mandatory federal audit because your VP of Federal Relations didn't know the difference between a GSA schedule and a grocery list. You aren't victims of a glitch, Arthur, you are victims of your own arrogance." Arthur closed his eyes, the final realization hitting him like a physical blow. The family legacy he had tried so hard to protect by pushing me out was the very thing that had destroyed it. Without the federal contracts, Sterling Logistics was just an oversized trucking company with a massive debt load and a vacant boardroom. "What do you want, Donald?" he whispered, opening his eyes. They looked tired, defeated, and entirely empty. "Name your price." I picked up a thick, bound document from my desk and slid it across the counter toward him. It was a pre-drafted acquisition proposal. "Vanguard will buy Sterling Logistics' remaining physical assets, the warehouses, the fleet, and the regional routes, for 20 cents on the dollar," I said calmly.
It's enough to cover your outstanding bank loans and keep you out of bankruptcy court. But the sterling name comes off the building. And neither you nor Julian will ever hold an operational position in this industry again. Arthur stared at the document, his hand trembling as he reached out to touch the cover page. The man who had told me I had hit my ceiling was now looking at the floor I was offering to put under his feet. "I'll give the board your terms," Arthur said, his voice barely audible. He turned around and walked slowly out of the office, the heavy glass door clicking shut behind him for the last time. I walked over to the window, watching his town car merge into the gray, bustling traffic of Washington, D.C. The rain had finally stopped, and the sun was breaking through the clouds, reflecting sharply off the white marble of the Capitol. The family was still in control of their company. There just wasn't any company left to control.